When you have a section with the programs indicated through color zoning, I'm not sure how effective it is, especially because, for example, when you're looking at the viewing deck, it's a segmented area, and then you have the topmost floor as the usable zone, but the entire segmented element, folding element, is actually stretching towards the ground. Maybe that's the idea that he was trying to say, that the entire structure is actually a viewing deck, but only the topmost part is the usable area. Normally when you have a section and you use color to program the areas or the floors, you shade the entire floor. But then in this case, he segmented the entire structure and then assigned each segment as a zone. I'm not sure if it is effective, but I find it interesting. For example, when you're looking at the viewing area, the usable area is only the topmost floor, but the entire segment stretches towards the ground floor, which is not actually usable. Maybe he's saying that the entire segment is a structure for viewing, and one segment is a structure for another use. And then this is the location of the site. It's going to be along Pasig River, which is really interesting. So we can already assume that he's trying to propose a ferry station for this structure. And we see the space programming based on color, which he classified into two. One, it is very linear and like a list of spaces, and the other one is based on how people will move around the building or circulation. Of course, we're not going to discount this kind of information presented by the student, because this is stretching the project far to advance, and when this exercise is just all about creating parameters for the architectural form, and I'm not sure if this is going to be useful for that objective. Then it's now showing the wind diagram, showing how the air will behave inside the structure, which is actually okay. And then we have the sun diagram analysis, and again, these are analysis, not a tool to sort of change the form of the structure that they are modifying. What we're talking about when it comes to the phase of this activity, the modification of the form by using the parameters of the site, the parameters of the program, and in this case it's talking about accessibility, line sights, etc., and definitely the form will change. I'm not sure how the sun and wind were used to sort of modify the structure. Disregard the program at this point. We cannot really criticize it based on the functionality. This is just all about form making, and when we're looking at this, this is an interesting section, and we know as a ferry station there can be more to it than just a museum-like space. I like the fact that they're presenting their section this way, so that they are more familiar with how complex architecture can be, and that way they can have that intuition later on when they are working on their final architecture project. This is a student to push his site selection on another level, because he's choosing a site that is totally inaccessible to many of us at this point. He's choosing Mars, and I'm fine with it, because for as long as he was able to set the condition and he has enough information that will back up his form finding, I am okay with it. This guy is very enthusiastic about the plans of colonizing Mars. But again, I want to reiterate that this is just a small exercise, and I'm worried that they're missing the point of what we're doing. He was able to identify the particular location in Mars. He calls it Candor Chasma. He also has information about ventilation, how much dust is carried by the wind. It's actually good that he has a table showing the properties of the site, on how it can be useful for the human inhabitants. And he also cited a site in Chile, the Atacama Desert, as a comparison. The hypothetical section, which is actually okay. We're looking at the form finding research, and he's showing a radiation map of the Atacama Desert in Chile, and then a wind diagram and a sun diagram. And then we see the process that is just basically a blade interlocking through the form of the section, but it's not clear how it is used. In figure 7, we have information such as how the wind is going to penetrate the building, but this is already given information. So what we're looking at this process is that how it is going to change the form. We're just looking at the cube that is not even similar to the hypothetical section. So I'm really confused. And we saw a portion of the skin for solar power harvesting, and it's not clear, or it didn't show how it's going to be located, or what's the basis of the location. These are the things that is very critical in this process. Same case as the previous work, when they totally disregarded the project brief or probably forgotten about it. It's all about folding architecture or maintaining the continuity of material. This is looking like a generic modern building. In fact, the SDA building where they study looks like this. I get excited when I see research translate into diagram, and I'm looking at ideal spaces by Kozica and Trover. And if you can, you have Personal Space by Edward T. Hall, which everybody knows about. And I was curious how this was used in the information in carving the form. Unfortunately, we get an exploded diagram without any connection to this information. So there's a huge missing link. And then we see the final section, and we don't see a lot of changes happening because after all of those talk of research and process, we didn't see the application of those ideas influencing the final form. The wind didn't change it. Well, the solar panel can be anywhere, and the program is still sort of the same. And most important of all, it completely disregarded the main project brief, which is all about maintaining the continuity of material. You just have, you know, a very generic type of a building with this section. I mentioned earlier that students were given the freedom to choose the programs that they will use for the project, for this exercise. And in this case, it's an idle lifestyle program. I don't know what it is, but it sounds creative. It's meant for vloggers. Hypothetical section, we have a gradient of grays indicating the different zones and activities for this typology. It's actually interesting because he used aspect ratio as a parameter or as a tool to define the proportion and the scale of the cubes that he will use for form finding. Later on, you will see that he stacked these volumes, almost mission boxes, on top of one another to create an interesting form. And how we wish at this stage that there's a basis for the stacking of the form, not just an arbitrary type of putting them together. It's actually more interesting to me because yes, in the Philippines you need to avoid the heat of the sun, but in this case he used it romantically, sort of, meaning that he used the sunlight or the sunshine to sort of define the spaces. It's not necessarily comfortable, but it's something that he wants to use poetically, probably, that when you're standing at a space is actually defined by the sunlight. So he was able to define that at different times of the day, like he has a space for sunrise, sunset, etc. He showed space planning at this stage, which is not very relevant, as I was saying, but it's okay. But probably if the space planning indicates the reason for the stacking, then probably it's more acceptable. When he was showing the wind diagram, probably the volumes are sort of sliding against each other. That way it can sort of control the way wind penetrates through the building. Although of course when it comes to the functional aspect of this proposal, it's still a question because probably the wind diagram might become irrelevant if the building is going to be air conditioned. End up with this diagrammatic section that is very generic. Not much has changed from the beginning, from the hypothetical section, because it is understandable. He's just using volumetric boxes. The students had the option to use their original form from the models that they built. It's another case wherein the continuity of material is actually disregarded again. You can see the disconnection of the ramps and the floors. They're not really connected, but for the sake of the hypothetical section, this actually can qualify showing the proposed programs. And then this is another case of overexcitement wherein you can see details in the interior vignettes, which is actually very irrelevant at this point. Then we see the process diagram showing the sun and wind carving, and it's actually correct. And you're wondering why she's starting with a plain cube when her hypothetical section is coming from a very complex form. The process is correct, and I can see some ideas percolating, but it's totally disconnected, especially when you're looking at the final product. You are given a section wherein You see all of those floors happening, and then you have all those folding gestures happening in the background that came out of nowhere. And then there's also a waterfall. Where did it come from? It just magically appeared. Don't get me wrong, because I appreciate the effort of this student. Because if she's going to work for me or another big company, I will appreciate that she has the effort to sort of create these little vignettes that will make the client appreciate the spaces more. Our term is all about process and how you can defend your idea based on that process, and the process is lacking. So this is going to differentiate you, the student, from the designer who is just actually indulgent with forms. When we say indulgent, you're just copying forms because it looks interesting and looks cool to you. But the moment you're asked why they are existing, you can't explain it. And this is a good example of that. And beautiful perspective drawings, and this is going to be very useful later on, but at this point it's actually useless. For the hypothetical section, this is actually clear. You can see the color zoning and the areas, but I'm not sure about the atrium. There's some sort of a porous skin or fabric. For me, it's just decorative. It doesn't really serve any purpose. Maybe because it makes the section interesting. This is one of the clearest sun diagram carvings submitted this week. You can see the chronological order of how it started and how it ended up. Even though it's line types, it's actually on point, except that probably it can be refined in terms of density, presentation wise, but overall this is actually readable and understandable. When it comes to views, any building for that matter, when you put arrows on all sides, you can easily claim that there are views. That's why when it comes to referencing views for a project, you need to reference the actual site. That way it's more objective. That way it's more agreeable. Again, the updated section, very evident. The continuity of material is lost, but you see a generic building with questionable porous fabric in the atrium, and then wood finishes, which is actually not very important at this stage of the exercise. I like the fact that the context has massing. That way you can really reference the building properly. And this student started with a generic volume with an area for learning, area for composting, bicycle parking, etc. He also indicated how the movement is going to work in this building. Even with these early slides, I can notice that the continuity of material and folding architecture are disregarded, which is, I think, can still be applied later on. Well, without the idea of the folding architecture, if we're just going to judge this based on the form that he proposed, this is actually a good example of how you can carve your existing building to welcome the sun. So he created fenestrations on the rooftop so that the sunlight can go inside, and it happens in different parts of the building. So this is a sort of a carving process. When it comes to the wind parameter, I'm not sure how permeable this building is because it wasn't shown in the model. But when it comes to visual marker, again, I appreciate the contextual massing. So you can really reference the surrounding building in relation to the openings of his building. And speaking of, where the building doesn't have enough details to show that this is an opening that sort of makes you see the detail of the neighboring building. I think that's what's lacking in this information. I also like that he has a street level visual referencing of the views from the sidewalk, and I think it's very important that architects recognize how normal people view our buildings, the architecture in the city. Then when we see the updated section, we can really see the change from the previews. Even though it's a very simple cubist building, you see the modification. But again, it loses the folding qualities. It loses the continuity of material because it looks like a conventional building. I remember this model last week. I criticized this heavily because I sort of read that he was limited with the outside form, and now he rose to the occasion. You can see that the folding is actually happening inside, and from this diagram you can see ramps going in and out forming the hypothetical section. And the hypothetical section is very simple, but it's very clear, and I think it's an important aspect that we need to remember as architects, to be very clear with our communication. Analysis, which at first you'll think it's just an analysis, when in fact he used it as a tool to sort of carve the back part of the building. Very strong on maintaining the facade or the other side intact when it comes to composition, but the other side very different. And this is where he used the sun and wind diagram as a tool to sort of make them different. This slide we see how air behaves, and of course you still have the continuity and the folding quality to it, and then you recognize some additional elements such as the windows, which is understandable at this point, where the air will pass through, and a carved portion showing the direction of the views. And he also exposed some areas that is still shaded that will become a public place, like a mini park in the. He enumerated the program, again not very important at this point, but very refined way to show it. And when you're looking at the final form, beautifully and simply presented, but the other side maintained, and the other side very interesting profile or carved surface. I find this a very elegant and refined way to carve a form, because there's a restrained practice by the designer. You remember this in my thumbnail in my previous video, and he's using the same form for this exercise. He segmented the parts of the complex form so that he can better understand it, and then on the second slide you can see that he sectioned it so that somehow we can have an introduction of the different levels he introduced for this build. The hypothetical section, he didn't use any color zoning for it. Instead, he used just labels. It reminds me of how Rem Koolhaas' section is Seattle Public Library. Maybe the only comment I can provide is a big difference in terms of proportion and scale when it comes to the relationship of the people and the architecture. It's also showing that he's not using the former model as a basis, but he's also refining it, and I appreciate that update on this process sheet. He provided an introduction sheet for his sun diagram carving, wherein he set it at 3 timestamp. What I appreciate about this presentation, that he takes time to explain it one by one per sheet, and in this case you can see that there are 3 rows of forms still explaining the same form. One row explains one side, the other one is another, and so on. And this is actually very useful if the form is very complex. That way you can clearly explain to your client or to any person what's going to change or what's going to be modified with the architecture. Maybe the only thing that is not clear, especially when it comes to the sheet, is that is he exposing the interiors to the sun, or he is avoiding it? But definitely there was some modification when it comes to the overall envelope. Like I said in the previous presentation, it's really difficult to use sun as a carving tool for the exterior. It's more applicable when it comes to the interior, because you can really manipulate light, because again, the scale of the sun is so huge compared to the actual building. Same thing can be said for his wind diagram, or the wind carving tool, wherein he indicated the areas for the openings to welcome the air, and then the outlet for it. And when it comes to the view carving diagram, I'm not so sure if it is actually good, because normally when you have a viewpoint, you sort of frame that particular view, and like I said, context is very important in this regard. But if the position of the designer is that he is framing the view in a very abstract manner, it doesn't matter if it's going to be circular, it doesn't matter if the window is going to be rectangular, for as long as he defines that, let's say, the dome of a church inside a very abstract profile, then I guess it is okay. And in this presentation, I think that's exactly what he's doing. One thing about the wind direction is that it's not enough that you open one side, or you create a small opening on one side and then you have another opening on the other. Because if you have an interior space that it has a wide expanse, because the moment the air enters the space, it's actually completely open. You miss the opportunity to control them. So I'm not sure if his inlet and outlet idea is effective in this proposal. I like the summary of forms when it comes to the carving, sun, wind, and view tools. I appreciate the isolation of the circulation elements such as the ramping. I also appreciate the isolation of the circulation areas as indicated in this diagram. And it's just that again I begin to question about the views because he's claiming panoramic views in this proposal, wherein he has a lot of facets applied that covers and becomes an opening. So I'm not sure if the panoramic term is applicable in this idea. You can see that this is a student who actually does more, extends the process so that you can better understand it, hence the summary of process. And I appreciate that. He also has a segmented version of the form, and then the updated section that shows us how the interior of this building changed. A student that takes contextual massing to another level, because this is a very specific area and the massing that she uses is actually existing in the Bonifacio Global City in the Philippines. And for the hypothetical section, she's proposing a therapeutic boarding school. I like the almost scientific-like presentation laid out like a poster, and she indicated different dates and angle of the sun, and then she ended up with an interesting form. It's the same case with the wind diagram, wherein she indicated the side wherein the inlet is going to be and the outlet on one side. It's just that it's the same case as the previous work, wherein the moment you have an immense space in the interior, sort of lose of air. So I'm curious how this information or this modification is going to develop. We have to teach them the process of translating a creative research into a space or physical space, but for this exercise I appreciate the attempt, so I'm not going to criticize how the sensory isolation is going to be effective in this regard, but I'm just looking at it as a form and as a programmatic zoning, and we can still see that the continuity of the material is maintained. This is the most impressive part of this batch of submission, because although it was not required, she's still showing an unfolded version of the entire building, which shows the complexity and how much thought she put in so that she can maintain the continuity of the material. Also segmented the floors, and then demonstrating how much she understands the form when you cut it into sections, which I think is very impressive. I'm not gonna nitpick on the consistency of the project brief, which is the full layer architecture, because clearly when you're looking at this updated section, you see additional elements such as interior walls. Bottom line here is that you can see that the folding happening all throughout, and then the auxiliary or accessory walls are negligible. When you're situating your building in a CBD, in a busy place like Bonifacio Global City, you will need to consider the local peripheral building or the contextual massing, because the smallest obstruction can affect the velocity or the direction of the wind. But for the sake of this exercise, this is a very general idea of how we can situate and locate openings in the massing in order to receive the prevailing wind. So the fact that the student reflected the massing of the city, it's already an indicator that she's very sensitive. She's considering the local context. The presentation of this student is next level. For the hypothetical section, we can see how detailed the drawing is. The proposal is a holistic wellness center for post-traumatic stress disorder because of the pandemic. And like I said, this is too detailed at this point, but we are going to entertain it for the discussion of the zoning of the areas. And I like the fact that she even pushed and pulled the volumes just for this hypothetical section. Everyone else, she carved the cube so that she can indicate the areas for sun exposure and areas for shading. And what I appreciate about the next slide is that she set two parameters, one for summer solstice and winter solstice. Then she created three timestamps for this sun exposure. I think she's trying to control the quality of light at different times of the day. Example, for summer solstice at 10 a.m. There's a light directly hitting the skylight, and then on winter solstice, um, the natural penetrate the interior spaces. So I like the fact that she's considering all of these things, not just in a very simplistic manner, but also in different conditions of the sun's angle. Presenting your project with the site, the prevailing wind is always the basis, but let me clarify that when we are using the wind rose diagram, we are referring to unimpeded wind velocity. So meaning there's no obstructions around the area, there are no trees, etc. So for the sake of this exercise, it's just all about wind orientation. Actually, I assume that she's using the physical context as basis for the wind direction. As for the creative parameter, like I said in the previous student work, it might be too early for them to discuss all of these ideas and theory on how spaces can be therapeutic or how spaces can treat certain illnesses. We're not at that stage yet, but I appreciate the effort, and just like the previous student, it's really commendable to see an unfolded version of the form, just for them to demonstrate how well they understand the architectural massing. But again, I'm not going to nitpick on the folding architecture, maintaining continuity stuff, but this is the updated section, and you can see clearly that the student got the project brief perfectly from a simple section with the push and pull diagram, push and pull gesture, and now you have the folding gestures happening, and then the programs updated, and the carving reflected. So this is really good work. When the students were asked not to use any text or any paragraph explaining their design, this student is taking it to another level, to the point of you don't see any text at all except symbols and some few letters or words. So for the hypothetical section, it's a very clear section of a building, and he's using the same form as the model that he used last week. He creates really beautiful site diagrams reflecting the accessibility, the direction of the wind, as an initial introduction for this process. And he took off from this previous model or previous form and then assigned zoning through colors, and he generalized it into a very basic cube form with subdivided layers of areas. And what I like is that he is considering that the area is flood prone. So the model and the form adjusted according to that condition. To the view quality management, according to the terminology that he used, he referenced Ermita, Intramuros, and the ferry station. That's why he has that a diagonal cut at the corner. But again, like I said earlier, he needs to consider the other conditions of the site, such as the bridge that might block the view, and then the post office that will totally block the Ermita area. But of course, as a process, this is actually acceptable and commendable at this stage. I also understand that they cannot go out because of the pandemic, but we can already see that the student is very familiar with the site. Probably he worked on this project before. So recognizing that this is going to be a ferry station, we can see clearly that he's indicating that corner facing the existing ferry station as a receptacle for the crowd going inside the building. And this is what we call programmatic carving, wherein it influences how the interiors will be planned. This slide becomes questionable because I don't know if these are pathways of the ferries or a wind diagram. It's really confusing. So this is a slide showing the carved area of the form, showing a possible atrium. This influences the movement of people inside the building. Slide is showing a more concise version of a sun diagram, showing the different location of the sun. And the succeeding slides show how he is carving the entire form. To be clear, he didn't stop at the sun carving process. He showed one form to another, the changes in the architectural massing, one with the program, the color-coded zones, one with just the form, and then one with how wind will go through the building. Extend it further because I think he's saying that the program that he's proposing is all about mobility. That's why the building is permeable. The building has an access towards the river, towards the ferry station, and towards the interesting is called the street. Like I said, I'm not going to nitpick, just like the two previous student work. But if I am, when we're looking at the form with the section cut, one side is almost like reads like a firewall, and that indicates that a lot of the floors in the interiors are abutting that wall. So there was a termination, so the continuity is actually abruptly disrupted. So it was somehow lost in this form. But overall, the fact that he expanded the process um, in more than 10 sheets, I think that's an impressive amount of work and amount of thought process. Make somebody understand without him explaining it in person, and just by using visual communication tools, I think is highly commendable. Complain about this set of students because they are giving more than what they are asked. This is a late post, but given the provided time limit, this is still an impressive set of work. A lot of them expanded the carving process extensively. Notice that the students tend to forget what they previously learned and totally disregard what the project is all about. Learning is also a step-by-step process, and there's a connection between lessons. I understand that many students, or some of them, are actually very advanced when it comes to creativity and their design skills, but they also need to step back and slow down in order for them to see that there's a learning outcome expected from each exercise. It's not about stifling creativity, but it's all about creating parameters for the design. Again, this is not an artwork. This is not an expression. You need to balance the two because as an architect, we are working with rules and conditions. It's either you create it or you work around it. And for the first two episodes, we're in the concept had to be reviewed if it's reflected objectively or physically. Now we are referring to research, how the research is applied towards the orientation of the site, how it affects the form. This is one way to show that architecture is actually a multifaceted discipline. We were just talking about concept, and we are just talking about these parameters that I talk about. These are just a few. We're not even talking about creative research yet. A few factors that influence architectural form. Slowly approaching the end of this exercise, and you will see later on that they are going to start their final term project. And I hope you stay with us and watch the entire process. And again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.